Hey, this is our next lecture. I think we're lecture 10 now. This is Statehood, Secession, and Civil War. The war with Mexico, just to kind of recap, involved a three-pronged attack by the United States, an invasion into New Mexico, into California, and then directly into Mexico via the north, and then later on in Central Mexico through Veracruz, and a march across Mexico. Approximately 6,000 Texans participated in the invasion and war with the United States and Mexico, primarily mounted volunteers calling themselves Texas Rangers, although to be clear, these were not officially the Texas Rangers. These were people in the United States Army. The Army adopted a policy where they adopted full regiments if they presented themselves whole. So a group of Rangers said, we're Texas Rangers, we're presenting ourselves for service, and they get adopted into the U.S. Army. These Ranger units, earned a good reputation as soldiers, with Zachary Taylor particularly singling them out. However, elsewhere they created pretty bitter memories. They carried their frontier individualism to an extreme and wreaked bloody havoc on civilians, cold-bloodedly disposing of pretty much anybody that was aiding in any form of resistance. And in many cases, they offered no quarter in search and confrontations with Mexican guerrilla fighters. The war's end came with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It confirmed the United States' title to Texas and ceded New Mexico and California to the United States. The United States paid $18.25 million and also stated that those of Mexican descent living in these newly taken lands would enjoy the full rights of U.S. citizenship, and that their property rights were to be inviolable, meaning the property rights are to be respected no matter what. This conflict, however, left a hostile legacy between the United States and Mexico. Mexico began to blame its ills on imperialism and condemn virtually all things American. For the United States, the war brought the issue of slavery's expansion to the forefront of our political discussions. Would the territories be organized on a slave or free basis? Texas would play a vital role in all of this stuff, given their acceptance into the Union and how that strengthened the South's position in their overall argument about the future of slavery. So now that the statehood question has been settled for the United States, let's look at Texas as a state, and then we're going to look at secession and ultimately Texas's part in the Civil War. Following annexation, I know I mentioned this in a previous lecture. Following annexation, Texas remained a magnet for immigrants seeking new beginnings. The first federal census taken in Texas in 1850, so the first time Texas has been part of the United States' federal census, revealed a population of 212,000. Now, if you remember back to when we were talking about the lead up to the War of 1848, in 1840, the census showed 162,000. So there was just an enormous amount of inbound migration into Texas. So it's more than 212,000. While it's diverse, more than one half of the 212,000 were Anglos from the southern parts of the United States. The South provided two groups, those from the lower South, places like South Carolina west to the Gulf Coast, and clustered in the eastern and southeastern section of Texas. This section of the state had commercial farms that used slave labor to grow cotton, sugar, and rice. Those emigres from the upper South, the border states that separated the deep South from the north, ranging from Virginia to Missouri and Missouri and Arkansas, gravitated toward the northern part of Texas and the central parts of Texas. These peoples tended to run family farms dependent less on cotton and more on foodstuffs like wheat and corn. The census also listed Anglos from the northern parts of the United States, the largest coming from what we today refer to as the Midwest. with very few actually coming from New England and the Middle Atlantic state. Now, incidentally, Tejanos were already relegated to a numerical insignificance of only about 5% of the total population by 1850. So there's not a whole lot of quote unquote Tejanos in Texas. They remain concentrated in the lower Behar Goliad, in the Behar Goliad region and South Texas along the Rio Grande. A number of Germans who had migrated in the mid 1840s as part of the colonization efforts stood at right around 11,500. You can see all of these numbers in the graph on the screen. I'm not going to test you on the numbers. There's not going to be a question, for example, that asks you how many German emigres there were in Texas. By the eve of the Civil War, Texas's population had more than tripled to 600,000. Okay, so think about the metrics we're talking about. In 1840, it's 162-ish. In 1850, it's 212,000-ish. And by the Civil War, by 1860 and 1861, it's 600,000. Okay, the growth since the 1850 census was dramatic, with cultural and ethnic diversity being a hallmark of Texas. However, slavery and the politics of sectionalism infused into the state as well, to the point that whatever else the diversity might mean, the majority of Texans were going to be pro-secession, meaning they favored secession when that becomes an issue. Now, we're at mid-century, so let's take a look. During the Revolution, Texans believed, the Texas Revolution. During the Texas Revolution, Texans believed that the state should administer the state's public domain, to the point that Texas insisted on the same annexation to the United States, that the state controls everything. As a state, then, Texas perpetuated the land policy of attracting immigrants. In 1854, the Texas legislature passed the Texas Preemption Act, where the state offered homesteaders 160-acre parcels of land for as little as 50 cents an acre. And this is compared to the U.S. federal policy at the time, which was $1.25 an acre. Texas remained agrarian throughout the 1850s. In 1850, and again, these are numbers to give you an idea of what's going on. I'm not going to ask you, for example, how many bales of hay were created or how many bales of cotton are created. But this is about giving you an idea, a picture of what's going on in Texas. In 1850, there were 107 farms. By 1860, there were 35,568. What are referred to as, quote, improved acres. And remember, we talked about improved acres in the last lecture. It means building a house or putting a fence up or planting crops or clearing trees or digging a well. All of those things count as improvements. Okay, so improved acreage rose from just over 639,000 to more than 2.5 million acres in the state, in the now state of Texas. Cotton production increased dramatically as well, from 58,000 bales to 431,463 bales of cotton. Cotton thrived in the state of Texas, with the largest plantations extending from the lower valley of the Colorado River to the Sabine, a region populated almost exclusively by settlers from the south. And you can see on the map here precisely where we're talking about, with the banks of the Colorado extending to the Sabine River. These lands, which were worked on, again, primarily by enslaved peoples, produced lucrative returns for these planters, people who planted cotton, which financed further westward expansion at the time. Only about a third of Texas farms had enslaved laborers, as their workforce and a planter elite was quite small. Only 20% of the slaveholders owned 96% of the slave population. So it's a similar circumstance as what we see in the United States as a whole, where you have all of these slaves, but maybe 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5 people actually owned slaves. It's being more and more concentrated the longer we go into the history of slavery. Most slaveholders in Texas owned fewer than 5 slaves. So it's not that it's, while there are a large number of slaves and slavery is clearly important to Texas, there are not a large number of slave holders in the state of Texas, if that actually makes sense to you. As far as urban industrialization goes, in 1850, only about 10% of Texans lived in towns with populations of greater than 100. Now, this is startling given the era. Galveston was the largest city in Texas by far, with a population of about 5,000 people. Located on the Gulf, you should all know where Galveston is. It was a natural center for shipping, for storage, commerce, as well as manufacturing, banking, and cotton compressing. Only 4 other towns had more than 1,000 people at this time: San Antonio, Houston, New Braunfels, and Marshall, Texas. Austin, our state capital, had just over 600 people at this particular moment. By 1860, the number of towns with 1,000 plus people had increased to 20 of these places, with San Antonio now having 8,000 residents, surpassing Galveston as the biggest city in the state of Texas. North Texas, at this point, it's worth pointing out, North Texas still had no major cities at the outset of the Civil War. Dallas was the biggest city in North Texas, but it was still pretty irrelevant. And of course, if you ask people in Houston in 2025, it's still pretty irrelevant. That's just a joke. In terms of industry, it was clear that agriculture and cotton were still king, even in the state of Texas. The biggest non-agriculture employers, in the state were iron foundries in Galveston and Houston, and neither one of those places had more than 40 employees. So big-time industry just wasn't here yet. By comparison, places like New York and Pennsylvania had more than 22,000 manufacturing plants. Texas, a grand total of 983, with an average of 4 workers. Okay, so industrialization just isn't happening at this point. As far as transportation goes, travel, simply put, was not easy because as both a republic and a state, infrastructure remained under control of the counties, not the actual state. Lack of resources and a lack of concern meant poor roads, very few bridges, and a lack of clear navigable waters. Most of these places in Texas just did not prioritize this stuff. Not at this point, they're not. Later on, absolutely. But right now, in 1850 and heading into the Civil War, they're just not prioritizing this. Stagecoach travel was bad. It was the dominant form of travel, and it was bad. Intrastate movement of passengers, mail, and light freight were the hallmarks. 31 companies handled stagecoach traffic. Even though gold was discovered in 1848, Texans still did not create a line, basically a road to get to California, even though it's a natural spot to be in Texas and have a road that takes people straight into California. A San Antonio-San Diego mail line began, and it was horrendous. Passengers had to cross the Colorado desert by transferring from coaches to mules, which led to the obvious joke that people referred to that travel by this line as, quote, the jackass line. Between 1858 and 1861, something called the Butterfield Overland Mail began traffic into Texas. It originated from St. Louis, Missouri. And while it took passengers, its coaches were suited for transport of goods, not for passengers. And once the Civil War began, the Butterfield Overland, it just stopped operating. It ceased to exist. Railroads also lagged behind in Texas in the pre-Civil War era. In 1850, total track mileage for railroads in the United States was 90,201, while Texas had practically nothing in terms of track mileage. In 1853, a company called the Buffalo Bayou Brazos and a Colorado railway company commenced operations on 30 miles of track, reaching Brazoria County by 1861. In 1854, the state of Texas sought to encourage rail construction by giving railroad companies 16 sections of public land for every mile of track they laid. So you buy a mile of land to lay track down, you're going to get 16 sections around that mile that you purchased. But by 1860, again, to give you an idea of how this is just not a concern, by 1860, the state still only had about 400 miles of track. So transportation just is practically nothing at this point. As far as Texas society goes, inequality is the word for the day. The 1850 census disclosed sharp inequalities in the state of Texas. Most of the state's real and personal property, including enslaved peoples, and total wealth lay in the hands of an elite that made up less than 10% of the Texas population. And by the time the Civil War rolled around, it was still a matter of 7.5% of the Texas population held 56% of the wealth. So it's not a particularly equal or even distribution of wealth. Slaveholders in Texas, in particular, were among the wealthiest people in society, given their high investment in cash crop farming. They also tended to exert more political influence, holding a disproportionately large number of political offices. And again, this is not a surprise because similar circumstances were at play in other parts of the United States. People who were the wealthiest people in society, and slaveholders in the South in particular, held a disproportionate number of elective offices because of the thought that these are people who have a greater stake in the success or failure of society. So a lot of people in the United States, including in the South, quote, deferred to these wealthier people. Texas did the exact same thing. A lot of Texas, quote, plain folk simply did not share in the wealth in the state of Texas. Protest against economic inequality was neutralized by opportunities for upward advance, access to the ballot box for adult Anglo males, and the equalizing force of the frontier. The frontier was the one place in Texas, and indeed in the rest of the United States too. So Texas is not that unique here. But the frontier was the one place where class consciousness tended to fall apart just completely in the state. Labor organizations were practically non-existent in the state of Texas. No labor unions appeared in the state of Texas between 1838 and 1857. A pressmen's union emerged in 1857 when workers for two newspapers in Galveston asked for wage increases. In 1850, Galveston Carpenters organized Carpenters Local 7, but it was mostly for altruism. It was mostly a mutual aid group. So it was people pooling their money together and helping others amongst themselves who needed help. Otherwise, labor unions were pretty much nowhere to be found in the state of Texas. A lack of industrial development, small numbers of workers, and a faith in upward mobility made Texas what we would call infertile ground for labor activities. As for African Americans in the state of Texas, there were a grand total of 350 free blacks who lived in Texas, according to the 1850 census. Their status was ill-defined from a legal perspective, but it's worth pointing out that they possessed no civil rights before the law, and the white population in Texas clearly saw them as unwelcome in the state of Texas. What we see growing during this period is the number of enslaved people expanding rapidly. In 1850, there were a grand total of 58,000 58,558 slaves. In 1861, more than 182,000 people who were enslaved in the state of Texas. Enslaved people represented fully 30% of the state's population. Slave labor brought with it immense wealth in the 1840s and 1850s. Cotton profits far exceeded the value of all other commodities across the state. But Texans also saw slave labor as a means to restrain people of color. Whites in antebellum Texas, antebellum means before the war. So in this context, antebellum means before the Civil War. Whites in antebellum Texas saw themselves as virtuous, compassionate, and pious people, while enslaved people were dirty, evil, lascivious, and worse. This is language that's used in the writings of the day. So I'm not just using these words to kind of paint a picture here. I'm taking the words of people who are actually writing during this era. These attitudes were reinforced by other racist thinking and teaching of the era, that Africans were people of African descent were inferior, that they were what's called inassimilable, meaning they could not be assimilated into regular society. These ideas of inferiority and an inassimilability shaped people's attitudes. They believed that slave owners were the rational thinkers here, that they needed a system of repression, and it justified the abhorrent treatment of the enslaved people for as far as Texans saw it. The way they looked at it, and this is one of these moments where it sounds very weird to say this, okay? But Texans truly believed that slavery benefited the enslaved by uplifting them from the primal nature of their life in Africa. So slavery always fueled racism and was fueled by racism throughout its existence. It's never a matter of which came first. Was it racism and then slavery? They're hand in hand. They're always hand in hand in all of this stuff. As for the legality of slavery, the Constitution of 1845, which is created when Texas joins the United States, the Texas Constitution of 1845 considered slaves to be personal property that could be bought, sold, and separated from families at the will of their owners. The Texans defined slavery as a perpetual condition and forbid enslaved people from marrying, forming families, from bearing arms, assembling, or seeking redress from the courts. The law specified the allowances that slave owners had for whipping, for the number of whippings for theft, for violating, quote, the rules of proper public behavior, and crimes like murder and rebellion were punishable by death, according to Texas law. Like elsewhere, slavery was never so totalitarian that enslaved people were unable to develop their own social identities during this era. From Christianity, enslaved peoples borrowed tenets that assured them that all humankind was equal before God and worthy of forgiveness. They held the belief that in death they would find the freedom that eluded them in life. Now, although not recognized by law, enslaved people also arranged social units legitimized by a number of different things. Jumping in unison over a broomstick, for example, symbolized togetherness. Slave families were important sources of defense, offering love, kinship support, and self-worth against the horrors of slave life, particularly the physical and sexual assaults that were associated with chattel slavery in the United States and in Texas in particular. Enslaved people were quick to take advantage of a slave owner's attitudes towards certain facts of the human condition. Planters allowed for informal marriages and encouraged the creation of families. Now, was it done because these people were concerned about family and all of that? No, it was about making sure that enslaved people stayed where they were. had these bonds which made them more hesitant to run away. So slave owners encouraged them for those reasons. But it didn't matter why slave owners were encouraging them. Enslaved peoples would take advantage of this circumstance. So this was going to lead to reproduction. It's going to also, unfortunately, give enslavers more control over people. It's going to make workers more tractable, more dutiful, and even more productive. So this is a double-edged sword. A family meant something important to the enslaved, but it meant a whole new set of worries and fears relative to their new families. Within these slave arrangements, fathers and mothers sought to assert their respective roles. Husbands supplemented the family meal by hunting and fishing and trapping, taking odd jobs when they were permitted to. Wives tended to domestic duties in the slave household after their assigned domestic duties. Now, in addition to this, it's worth pointing out that enslaved people did not entirely resign themselves to complete submission to authority. Some coped, to be fair, some coped by not resisting at all, while others compromised privately. Okay? But many resisted in blatant and subversive ways, or what we refer to as overt subversion. Thousands of people ran away. Thousands of enslaved people headed toward Mexico or to some other southern states, typically the state of their birth, to seek loved ones. Others sabotaged the institution by essentially causing mischief by maiming or killing domesticated animals, or simply slowing down on the job, breaking tools. The most visible means of subversion was via a slave rebellion. Now, there is no record of major slave uprisings in Texas, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist and that people weren't afraid of these sorts of things. There were waves of insurrectional hysteria culminating in 1860 in something called, quote, the Texas Troubles. In 1860, there was this intensely hot summer, and a number of suspicious fires broke out in northern Texas, which led whites to fear that enslaved people who had been encouraged by northern abolitionists were finally starting to rebel by setting a bunch of fires. There was no evidence of any plot that was ever discovered. No plot was ever uncovered. Nobody was, quote, proven to be an insurrectionist. However, 10 Anglos and 30 African Americans were actually executed for their roles in the so-called Texas Troubles of 1860. Now, as far as Mexican Americans go, since 1836, Tejanos had tried to find a niche in Anglo-Texas society. From several towns in central Texas, Mexicanos were banished on suspicion of having assisted runaway slaves in reaching freedom in Mexico. Anglo freighters also launched hostile actions against Mexican-American teamsters in transporting goods across the interior of Texas to the Gulf. In what was known as something called the Carting War, or the Cart War, Anglos destroyed carts, they confiscated cargoes, they sabotaged equipment, and even murdered some of the drivers of these carts. This only ended, the cart wars only ended, when the Mexican government, the United States Secretary of State, and volunteer Texas companies intervened to restore order. Similar episodes occurred in South Texas between the Nueces and the Rio Grande rivers. Anglos began displacing Tejanos following the war with Mexico, and resentment produced a violent conflict in Brownsville, sparked at a cafe between the town's marshal and Juan Cortina, a local ranchero and a descendant of one of the original land grantees. Cortina's resentment stemmed from racist attacks on Mexicanos, Anglos' use of courts to dispossess Mexicans of their land, and a determined effort on the part of Anglos to replace Mexican-American leadership in the political structure. On July 13th, 1859, the marshal of the area hurled racial slurs at Cortina as he defended an elderly rancher that the marshal was beating. Cortina drew his gun and shot and wounded this particular marshal. Things seemed to calm down, but Cortina returned to Brownsville on September 29th, bent on vengeance. In the process, he killed 2 Anglos whom he believed were involved in the death of 2 other Tejanos. He followed this up by issuing 2 proclamations from his mother's ranch, denouncing all of those who were engaged in persecuting Tejanos. A number of Tejanos rallied to his cause, viewing Cortina as a hero. However, Texas Rangers and federal troops suppressed what was called the Cortina War early in the 1860s, and it resulted in a number of tragic deaths and property damage. Now, the frontier nature of Texas was also reflected in a skewed sex ratio in the state. The 1850 population showed men outnumbering women by nearly 16,000. By 1860, it was by 36,000. Many marriages in Texas were by nature an economic necessity, but Texas was far less patriarchal than the rest of the country given the scarceness of women in Texas. Women strangely found that it was easier to either dissolve or simply abandon an unhappy marriage in the state of Texas than it was elsewhere. A greater spirit of male-female cooperation existed in the state of Texas. There was a frequent amount of crossover into decidedly male roles because of the necessities of getting a certain amount of work done. Women still had a difficult time in Texas. I don't want to give the wrong impression about this sort of stuff. There's still a lot going on, but women, by and large, had it different in the state of Texas than they did in the rest of the United States. Now, despite the liberating tendencies, Texas's heritage remained almost entirely masculine, okay, and mostly discriminatory. Men expected women to subordinate themselves, and while this may not have worked precisely in the home, Texans did, from a social and political standard, restrict women's political rights, their legal rights, their social rights, and their economic rights. Okay, women could not vote in the state of Texas. Women were not permitted to sit on juries. Women could not take the pulpit or speak at public forums. And yet, a large number of women did actually participate in reform activities in the 1850s, particularly in abolitionism and later the women's rights movement, because the abolitionist movement tended to see the issue of freeing the enslaved and freeing women from what was called coverture as being one and the same struggle. That women, what coverture was a series of laws that restricted women from a social and political standpoint. So women didn't have a particular legal identity here. So within those reform circles, women had a little bit more room to maneuver, if you will. Married women could not. This is another area where we see women being kind of subjugated from a social standpoint. Women could not be assured of guardianship of their children in divorce cases, and they lacked the ability to control their earnings. So if a woman actually did work outside the home for wages, when she got her pay envelope, a husband was legally entitled to take her wages and say, this money that you earned is my money. Okay. Texas also upheld community property ideals, and as a result, some women were able to amass fortunes that their counterparts in other states couldn't. So there is this little bit of difference. While there's a ton of similarity, the Constitution of 1845 in Texas did say women can own property in their own right. So land, real estate, could actually be held without worry that it would be taken by one of their husbands. Something that in a lot of parts of the in the United States just didn't exist at this point. So I think the best way to put it is that women have it different in Texas. Probably not much better okay, than they do in the rest of the country, but they have it different than they have it in the rest of the country. All right, that'll do it for this particular lecture. We'll pick up with our next one shortly.